Welcome, everyone. It's Sunday, October 22nd. I'm very excited to welcome Adam Mansbach, author. He also has TV credits, but we're here today to talk about the Golem of Brooklyn. And you can see that I've marked it up because I'm going to be doing it for Evening Book Club. And it's an amazing read. It's an amazing read for October 2023. I forgot to tell Adam that I'm a crier, but I'm going to try to get through the rest of this without crying. Now, let me tell you a little bit about Adam. He is the author of over a dozen books, including the New York Times bestseller, and we're going to talk just a little bit at the end about this, Go the F to Sleep. And if this crowd, if you haven't heard about it, if you have grandchildren, this is the book for their parents. California Book Award winner, The End of the Jews, his memoir in verse, I Had a Brother Once, and most recently, the best-selling A Field Guide to the Jewish People with Dave Barry and Alan Zweibel. Mansbach wrote the award-winning screenplay for the Netflix original Barry. Oh my God. Yeah, that's so fantastic. His next film will be Super High with New Line. Also, he just got the news today that the Golem of Brooklyn is a bestseller. And so you're going to want to go out and get this book. I forgot to tell Adam, I have been saying that for a this is a fiction book, and it's under 400 pages. In fact, it's under 300 pages. And I, as a book group leader, when I have to assign something that's over 300 or 400 pages, I always shake my head. But this is the right amount and the right time. I really, and it's Adam, it's not just because you're here. I want to say that it's not just because you're here today. So I invite you to, I'm going to put you up on the screen. And if you can tell us a little bit about you, and then we're going to go into a conversation.
Sure. Thank you for having me. I'm very happy to be here. It's 8 o'clock where I am. So, my children, of course, woke me up at 6:30 to help me prepare for this gig. I also want to point out that as a mark of how special this particular appearance is for me, I'm wearing the same outfit that I wore in my author photo. I don't always do that. I own more than one sweater, but I chose to go all out today. So The Golem of Brooklyn is the new book. Maybe I should talk a little bit about what a golem is in case folks are not conversant. In Jewish folklore, a golem is a humanoid creature made out of mud or clay, typically 9 or 10 feet tall, always made, constructed, built by a rabbi or a very learned man, and always at a time of crisis. And by crisis, I mean an immediate crisis, not sort of the existential existence of anti-Semitism in the world, but the villagers are marching with lit torches toward the Jewish quarter kind of crisis. In order to bring the golem to life, although scholars would agree that the golem is not technically alive, but merely up and about, animate, let's say, secret prayers and incantations are recited. And the last step is always either writing the Hebrew word for truth, emet, on the golem's forehead, or writing it on a piece of paper and inserting it into the golem's mouth. The golem comes alive, responds to the will of its creator, defends the Jews in some capacity, and when the crisis has passed, and as soon as the crisis has passed, the golem is returned to its inchoate state of mud or clay through the erasure of the letter Aleph from the word on the golem's forehead. The word emet, truth, becomes the word met, death, and the golem goes back to being a pile of whatever substance it was created out of. That's the golem of Jewish folklore. My golem is very different from that, but I guess we can get into that in a moment. Should I just get into that in the moment?
Get into that. Get into that.
All right.
Yeah, get into
So
that.
the golem of this book is not created by a scholar or a rabbi or a very learned man, and he is not created at a moment of immediate crisis. This golem is created by an art teacher in Brooklyn who has been stealing clay from his school for the past several years and has 400 pounds of it stacked up in his garden shed, and who happens to be extremely stoned. So he makes this golem. He manages to bring it to life by reading up on the esoteric secret prayers online. And when he brings the golem to life, the golem starts screaming at him in Yiddish, a language that Len, the art teacher, does not speak or understand. And the golem begins trashing his apartment. So Len parks the golem in front of a television screen, which happens to be playing a Curb Your Enthusiasm marathon, and he runs out to find a translator. This is in Williamsburg, Brooklyn. And he runs to a nearby bodega because there's a woman who works there who he doesn't know, but he once heard her speak a little bit of Yiddish. He heard her curse out some young yeshiva kids who came in to try to buy cigarettes. So he's like, aha. So he goes to the bodega to try to convince this stranger to come back to his apartment to translate for him so he can understand what this raging 10-foot tall golem is saying to him. Understandably, she's a little skeptical. We learn that she speaks Yiddish because she grew up in a nearby Hasidic sect, which she left at 18 because she's gay, and that lifestyle was not compatible with their worldview. And she's been working in this Yemeni bodega ever since. Eventually, the golem learns to speak English by watching this Curb Your Enthusiasm marathon after also accidentally ingesting a large amount of LSD. And what we learn about this golem, and this is the primary difference between my golem and all of the golems of folklore and previous stories and novels, is that this golem is a creature in possession of an ancestral memory. In other words, you don't make the golem, you only remake him. There's only ever been one golem throughout all of history. This golem dates back pretty much to the dawn of creation. And this ancestral memory means that in some ways, he's kind of this walking repository of Jewish history and trauma, two words that have been nearly synonymous throughout Jewish history. But it also means that he's only been around during some of the scariest, gnarliest, worst times in Jewish history, because again, you don't make a golem unless there's an active crisis unfolding. And in fact, we learn that what the golem has been screaming at Len this whole time is, where's the crisis? Because it's inconceivable to him that he could be created without a pressing, immediate reason. So Len, Miri, and the golem begin a kind of winding adventure. Eventually, in a very delayed answer to his initial and persistent question about where the crisis is, Miri shows him on her phone footage of the Unite the Right Charlottesville 2017 neo-Nazi Jews will not replace us marchers. And she's like, here's the crisis. These, you want to know who's trying to kill the Jews? These guys. The golem is like, finally, we're getting somewhere, and demands to know where he can find these guys. And it so happens that in a few days' time, there's going to be a similar rally in a town called Wagner, Kentucky, which I made up. I mean, Kentucky exists, Wagner does not. Called the Save Our History's Future rally, that's going to attract a similar kind of cross-section of the extreme white nationalist right. So the golem demands to be taken there. It's only when they're about halfway there that Len and Miri think to drill down a little farther on what exactly the golem intends to do when they get there. Len and Miri are like, you're just going to scare them, right? The golem is like, no, the golem gonna kill everybody. They're like, That's not good. That's not good for the Jews. That's, you can't kill everybody. You can't run amok and kill hundreds, possibly thousands of white nationalists. The Golem is like, that's my job. And ultimately, after a number of twists, turns, digressions, side trips, forays into the history of the Golem and some of the things he's done in 5th century Babylon and 11th century Spain and ancient Egypt, we reach this rally and we reach this point of kind of moral standoff between Len and Miri, as they realize that they really only have two options. You can let the Golem slaughter all of the anti-Semites, kill all of the enemies of the Jews, in which case you might be safe, but in which case also on some fundamental moral and spiritual level, you may no longer be recognizably Jewish. That's option one. Option two is that you kill the Golem. And this is sort of the quandary, the note on which the story comes to an end. So that's a little bit about the book. There's a lot more embedded in it, but those are kind of the broad strokes of it.
I think that's I'm just going to put me up here now. I think that's a great way to phrase it. And where you just gave the summary, but the humor and actually the historical detail that you go into, I found fascinating. And really, I also want to say, if anybody has a question, please raise your hand virtually because I can't see everybody, or you could put it in the chat, or at the end you can unmute yourself. But if you have a question, please, we invite all questions. Why did you choose the Golem, and how did you go about that historical research?
I had been interested in golems for a long time. I did some research on the Golem actually for a previous book, this humor book that I wrote with Dave Barry and Alan Zweibel, which you mentioned, called a Field Guide to the Jewish People. I'd been toying for some months, I think, with the comic premise of a guy who's very underqualified to create a golem, creating a golem. I had this notion of just the comedic potential of this lumbering giant monster screaming at a guy in Yiddish, which he doesn't speak, and trashing. That seemed like funny to me, but it also seemed it was a Saturday Night Live skit, not a novel. In fact, it was the kind of Saturday Night Live skit that's funny for 3 minutes and then drags on for like another 7. And you're like, when are they going to put this thing to bed? How are they going to get out of this? Separately from that, and this is often how my work kind of evolves, is that I'll be playing around with disparate ideas and I'll have a kind of eureka moment where I realize that there's a way to combine those ideas, and that will get me rolling. Separate from the Golem idea, I'd been thinking about writing kind of a speculative future science fiction novel, which is way outside of my wheelhouse. That's not in any way what I do, about epigenetics. A friend of mine does research on epigenetics. I've been thinking about the potential of that field for a few months also. Epigenetics being the increasingly accepted scientific notion that trauma can enter the DNA, that sufficiently horrible and grotesque and scarring events can actually sort of become part of your genetic material, your genetic record, and be passed down to your children, your grandchildren, etc. That's been a really fascinating idea for me to parse. And I had this very complex notion of how things might play out if that idea were not only proven, but if the trauma could be time-stamped. In other words, the specific moment that it entered the DNA could be mapped, and what that might lead to on a legal, legally speaking, like if you can now prove that because of Middle Passage or because of a pogrom at a certain point in history, this had been inflicted on you, what would be your legal recourse? What kind of reparations or damages could you demand? And I started thinking about that. And then I started thinking about the idea that this trauma could then be transplanted from one person to another. I went pretty far down the rabbit hole of mapping out this world. But I never quite figured out how to write the book that I was looking to write. I had more of a framework and a premise than a plot. And then one day I woke up and I realized that if I made the golem a creature with an ancestral memory, I could kind of do everything I wanted to do in that epigenetics book, in this golem book, and I could deepen the golem and give him a past and give him a meaning. There are generally two translations of the word golem from Hebrew. One is unfinished thing, and the other is empty vessel. And this was my way of making him not an empty vessel, but an extremely full vessel. And this got me writing. This got me thinking about the potential. From that point, as soon as I realized that, I sat down that day and wrote about a 5-page outline for what became the book. Although my first impulse was to do it as a screenplay. So I wrote up this, which is also why the book is the length that it is, because it was initially intended to be something you could, pretty quickly get into and out of. And
so is that screenplay going to come about?
Now that I'm no longer on strike, it's a distinct possibility. But I sent that outline to my agent, and he wrote me back a 1-line response, which was, "The golem market is dead." And I was like, okay, all right, Richard. So then I was like, well, I guess it's a novel then.
Is Richard Jewish?
Richard is not Jewish.
Okay.
Richard also frequently doesn't know what he's talking about. Richard also, when I sent him Go the F to Sleep 13 years ago, told me he couldn't sell that book either. So, the real question is, why don't I just fire Richard, I think, is ultimately what we're getting to here.
The minute I told my husband about this book, he said, "Oh, the golem, it was in the X-Files." And then he named 5 other, serials or TV series where they had brought up a golem. So tell Richard that.
The golem has certainly not been underexposed. I mean, he is probably the most prominent creature, supernatural figure in Jewish folklore. Maybe the Dybbuk would be up there, but there's been a lot of golems throughout literature and throughout folklore. So in terms of the research I did, as soon as I happened upon this conception of the golem as ancestral memory bearer, and also golem as like wise ass, violent, aggressive, the golem speaks in a particular way and it's not particularly polite. More than one friend of mine has suggested that the golem acts the way I would act if I were 9.5 feet tall. I didn't read every iteration of the golem. My approach to research tends to be, in a situation like that, what I did was sort of quickly review every golem text ever written to make sure no one had done the thing I wanted to do. And then I kind of set sail.
Abby wants to know, do you think we need the golem to keep us as Jews as we all gather around trauma?
Yeah, well, this is, of course, something I've been thinking about more and differently lately. I actually wrote an op-ed for the Washington Post about 3 weeks ago, which I can send the group a link to if people want to read it. Talking specifically about the notion of the golem in contemporary America or the contemporary world. And one thing I'd like to say on that topic is, throughout all of the folklore, throughout all stories of the golem, there are a couple of things that remain consistent. There are a lot of things that don't. The golem is sometimes a terrifying avenger. The golem is often a monster who is out of control, who the creator can no longer maintain control over. The golem is the template for Frankenstein's monster, for example, very clearly. Two things that remain consistent are the notion of writing truth and turning truth into death. So it's worth thinking about what it is about the golem that represents truth. Perhaps the golem represents the truth that we are in some sense never safe. That when you bring a golem to life, you embrace that terrifying truth that in many cases we prefer not to always have top of mind. The other thing that's consistent, and to me this is maybe the most poignant thing in terms of thinking about the golem in our contemporary reality, the golem is always, always de-animated the minute that the crisis ends. There's never a golem who acts as a standing deterrent or a nuclear option. And there's never an army of golems. Nobody ever makes more than one golem.
Oh, yeah.
It's a singular figure who is meant to complete a single task and then be unmade until such a time as he is needed again. And I think that that has to do with how much of our humanity we might sacrifice in always having a golem or an army of golems at our disposal. There's a way in which the creation of a golem is not a sanctified act or a clean act, right? There's something magical and mystical and dark and not fully above board about it. Now, we are given the recipe for the golem, you know, by the sages. There's Kabbalistic discussion of the golem. But in mimicking the act of creation, we are taking on a power that we can't ultimately control. There's a parallel, not just in the, you know, we're taking on a godlike power, not just by creating life, but by doing it through the manipulation of language, right? Which is even more so a fraught and dangerous territory to be engaging in. The golem only appears, the word golem only appears once in the Torah, and it doesn't refer to this being. It refers to Adam before God breathed the breath of life into him.
Yeah, and we just read that. We just read that in Breshit.
Okay, yeah, and it means unfinished thing. And there is a fraught sense about the golem and the creation of the golem and the existence of the golem. You know, I think a lot about that. I think about not what can both what can the golem do to protect us, but also how much we are risking and sacrificing to allow a creature of that kind of unfettered power and rage and an absence of reason in the folklore exist in the world. So, yeah.
Okay. I was Googling. So here's the link to the Washington Post. Neil said, conceivably, the golem is the whole basis of superheroes. The authors are Jewish after all. Agree?
I mean, when I think of the superheroes, the golem most reminds me of, I think of the Incredible Hulk, created by Jewish creators. I think of Ben Grimm, the Thing from the Fantastic Four, who kind of looks golem-y. And that character is canonically Jewish in the comics. Yeah. And yes, of course, the Golden Age, the Silver Age of comics, there was an outsized Jewish presence and brilliance that led to everybody from Superman to Spider-Man to the Incredible Hulk. So yeah, it certainly makes a lot of sense. There are differences, right? Typically superheroes labor under somewhat different moral burdens. I mean, the central trope of superheroism in some sense is the moral struggle of the superhero between fame and anonymity, between power and responsibility, between having a personal life and having a public persona and all of the things that mean. Typically, the golem isn't invested with those kind of moral struggles because he doesn't have the inner life that would allow for them. But I totally agree that the golem gives us a lot in terms of the later origin of all these superheroes.
I think I know the answer to this, but I can't help asking it. You know, Larry David is hilarious. Who hasn't watched Curb Your Enthusiasm? But why did you choose him? The comedic effect. And now that I know, you're a writer, he's a writer. Do you know him? Does he know you put him in the book? And I'm just going to say there's a later scene That's as I like to say, pee your pants funny. So how did the Larry David connection come about?
Yeah. I do know Larry a little bit. My co-author and friend Alan Zweibel, who I've written 4 books with, he and Larry are best friends, came up together doing stand-up in the Catskills and all that kind of thing, have worked together extensively. Alan was one of the original writers on Saturday Night Live. Um, Larry was also kind enough to record the audiobook for one of my books, a sequel to Go the F to Sleep called F, Now There Are Two of You, which Larry was kind enough to participate in. So he does know that he's in the book. And the scene, I'll talk a little bit about the scene you're referring to. At the point that I previously described, where Len and Miri sort of confront the golem about his plans when they reach this rally, they cannot convince him to listen to them. So in an act of desperation, they're like, look, you gotta, if you won't listen to us, fine, you gotta listen to somebody. Who's it gonna be? Is it the Grand Rebbe? Is it Uncle Josh? Is it Waleed? Is it Larry David? And the golem is like, the golem might listen to Larry David. And they're like, well, we can't actually get Larry David. So, and then Miri, manages on her phone to locate a phone number for Larry David's agent. So in the middle of a parking lot in West Virginia, she manages to call him and get him on the phone, pretending she's someone else, and is like, look, you don't know me, but I'm standing in a parking lot in the middle of West Virginia with a real life 9.5-foot golem, and he's about to slaughter hundreds of anti-Semites in Kentucky, and the only person who can stop him is Larry David. So I need to talk to Larry David. And Larry David's agent is like, I love it. So they managed to get Larry David on a Zoom. And when confronted with this possibility, Larry David is like, you mean those Jews will not replace us pieces of shit? He should kill as many as possible. The golem is like, thank you, Larry. Told you. So yeah, Larry plays a somewhat pivotal role in the book. I don't know why Larry David, except that it kind of made intuitive sense to me and was funny. I feel like a lot of what I do when I'm really in a good zone as a writer of fiction is I'm working from an outline. I'm never sort of just sitting before a blank page with no idea what I'm doing. But even in plotting and planning a book, there are things you do because they make sort of like intuitive sense to you, because in the language that you're developing, the sort of secret language of the book, they rhyme or they resonate. So it just made a certain kind of sense to me that Larry David be a presence in the book and that I appropriate his likeness in this way. So I just did it.
Well,
And then I made sure that Alan got the book to Larry so I could make sure Larry wasn't feeling litigious about my use of his likeness in the book.
all right, good. And did he like it?
Far as I know.
Okay. Good. Is there an audible of this book, and who reads it?
Yeah, the audiobook of this book is phenomenal and is read by my good friend and sometimes collaborator, Danny Hock, who is an actor and a playwright, came to fame in the 90s in New York doing incredible one-man shows where, the kind of thing where like, it's just a guy on a stage for 2 hours with nothing but like a hat, and he plays 17 characters. He's doing like a Polish grandmother and a Dominican cab dispatcher and all these different characters. I had to really fight hard to convince the publisher that Danny was the only guy who could read this book, to do, the voice of the golem, the accents of the Hasids, the Yiddish. There's actually a lot of Yiddish in the book because the golem, even after he learns English, continues to speak a lot of Yiddish. When he can't think of an English word, he switches to Yiddish. When he's angry, which is a lot of the time, he curses people out in Yiddish, because as we know, there's no better language to curse people out in than Yiddish. So Danny reads the book and I think does an incredible job.
Someone said, I got to run out and buy 3 copies, one for me, one for my son, and 2 copies of a field guide for my other daughter-in-law. Okay. We're selling books. That's great. And I'm going to put
I like this energy. Let's keep that going.
Let's talk a little bit about the Yiddish. So I read through the whole book, and then I was going to say, I was thinking, wow, Adam really knows Yiddish. And then I did read in the acknowledgments the person he thanked for giving him the Yiddish for everything. But I, I I'll just ask, why Yiddish? Was it easy to get the right phrases with your friend?
Yeah. Yeah, I'm extremely grateful to my good friend Eddie Portnoy, who works at YIVO in New York City, has a PhD in Yiddish, and made himself very, very available to me on a minute by minute basis, so that anytime I needed a Yiddish phrase, I could just send him a DM. I'd be like, Eddie, how do you say rip his arms off in Yiddish? And immediately he'd email me back. And the great thing about Eddie is not just that he speaks the language, but that a lot of times he would ask me for context so that he gave me the right word or the right phrase, which was incredibly helpful. If I was like, Eddie, how do you say abomination, or how do you say monster? He'd say, well, what are we talking about here? Do we mean an abomination in the sense of a creature that is unholy and shouldn't exist? Do we mean someone who has sinned and broken laws? Do we mean, like, what are we talking about? And it would force me to drill down on my own thinking and my own needs. In some way, I wish I had somebody to do that for me in English on a sentence by sentence basis. I mean, Yiddish is an incredibly rich and evocative language. I chose it. The description of Yiddish I always like is that Yiddish is a combination of German and phlegm. Um, the golem of this story is a creature who has existed mostly in Ashkenazi Jewish folklore. So in my mind, would have been speaking Yiddish for the bulk of his existence, or at least the last 1,000 years of his existence. So that made sense to me. I also like the idea, and the Yiddish in the book, for the most part, goes untranslated.
Yes, it does. I tried and I couldn't,
Yeah, which is off-putting to some people. In my mind, it's done for effect. I mean, people who speak Yiddish will, of course, get all of it. People who speak a little Yiddish will get a little of it. People who speak a few words of Yiddish or no Yiddish over the course of the book will learn a few words that come up again and again.
Yes.
But it's like sometimes in a movie, the filmmakers will choose to, have you watch a conversation in Spanish or French or Polish and not translate it. And they want you to be a little confused, a little dislocated. They also want you to let the language wash over you and maybe understand it in an intuitive or non-linguistic way. I like the idea. And of course, the book is told from different points of view, from Len's point of view, from Miri's point of view, sometimes from other characters' point of views, occasionally from the point of view of a cat who lives in the bodega where Miri works. But Len doesn't speak any Yiddish, and his confusion at hearing it, in many cases, I wanted the reader to feel the same confusion. So yeah, the Yiddish is meant to be sort of evocative and mysterious in those kinds of ways for the majority of readers who won't speak or understand it.
I happened to watch Saturday Night Live last night, and Bad Bunny, who's from Puerto Rico, and I would say half of the show was in Spanish. Some of it was translated, some of it was not. And I think it's for the same reason. Of course, there's a lot more people in the Saturday Night Live audience who speak Spanish than, I don't know if your audience, what percentage of your audience speaks Yiddish? I also wanted to talk about a little bit about Len and Miri. Len is, he's hilarious. It's interesting to see what he did with the whole golem thing and art teacher. But I wanted to go down the rabbit hole a little bit with Miri. She was, brought up as a Sasov Hasid. So why'd you pick the Sasovs? And the other, we would say off the derech. She's not, she decided this isn't for me. And she's gay. So how did you decide to give her all those qualities?
I like the idea of someone in counterpoint to Len, So Len is not in any way observant, nor is he particularly knowledgeable. He considers himself culturally Jewish. Um, but at the same time, a lot of his most deeply held values, moral values, he feels are very Jewish values. So he's got this intuitive sense that governs his life of what it means on a deep level to be Jewish. But he's also very ignorant and follows no laws and doesn't, go to synagogue or have any institutional Jewish presence in his life. Miri, by contrast, grew up in this incredibly religious, regimented world in which, as a woman, she was also not educated the way she would have been if she was a boy. By virtue of being gay, she always felt alienated and other and different, and got out as soon as she could. But she also continues to live in the same neighborhood she grew up with. And I thought it was interesting, the idea of someone who chooses to make the incredibly scary and bold and courageous move to leave everything they've ever known, but to relocate about a mile away. She's sort of just outside the meniscus of the bubble of that world. She can still hear the sirens on top of the yeshivas announcing the Sabbath every afternoon, but she's abandoned or been abandoned by that entire community by virtue of who she is and the choice she made to live as the person she is, not to sublimate her sexuality and so forth. So I thought that the two of them made interesting foils for each other. Miri, as someone who grew up in but ultimately rejected this very strict Orthodox world, and Len as someone who has always lived with a certain amount of comfort on the margins of Judaism. I'm very interested in general in the notion of margins, right? Like, I think that any community has people who sit comfortably and firmly in the center of that community, who feel comfortable, who feel seen, who feel secure. And then there are margins where people are neither fully in nor fully out. They feel conflicted, they feel ambiguous, they feel ambivalent, they feel like they don't quite know their place. Those people, I think, have a unique perspective. And in the Jewish community, because of the nature of Judaism, the complexity of a Jewish identity, those margins are enormous, right? Because Judaism is the Hotel California of religions. You can check out, but you can't leave. So my sense is that that's where a lot of the great art comes from, is from those people and the pain of that situation of being on the margin. So in different ways, I wanted Len and Miri to both be somewhere in that wide marginal space, if that makes sense.
It makes sense. I appreciate them that they're on the margins. People always say, where do you get your members from? And, are they coming from this synagogue or that synagogue? And I am quick to reply that if we really want to take in new members, you have to go to the unaffiliated. And 50% of Jews are unaffiliated. And that's a lot of people that we could get to come in and not feel marginal and, feel part. And, I think all the reasons that you just said, not feeling comfortable or whatever, lead to why they're not there. Diane wants to know, why not add an index addendum translating the phrases?
Again, because I wanted some mystery around the phrases. I mean, if people want to do the tremendous labor themselves of figuring out the translations, that's great. But I think an index or an addendum would have created a situation where you're reading with two bookmarks, where you're flipping back and forth. To me, that would have been tremendously distracting. But more than that was just that I wanted to maintain a level of mystery, to let the Yiddish wash over people, and in some ways to have them experience the confusion that Len feels when he's hearing the Yiddish and that other characters feel when they're reading the Yiddish.
Yeah. Len asks, are you familiar?
Not that much Yiddish to be.
Yes. It's just like, sprinkled in.
It's like, there's maybe in a 270-page book, there's maybe like a total of 3 pages worth of Yiddish. It's like a phrase or a sentence here and there.
Yes.
And a lot of times the Golem will say something and then Miri will translate it. The Golem will be like, you not prophet, you not rabbi, you not, what is word, novi, and she'll be like prophet or what, there's some of that.
Yeah,
So I don't want to scare people. Like
exactly.
the book is 99% in English.
It is. It is. Um, I think, having read the book, it just gives it that flavor, and it does give a mystery to the golem, who is funny yet tragic. I know a number of your book suggestions have had Yiddish in it, and it provides a wonderful secret ingredient, not necessary, but certainly enriching or mysterious. And she's looking forward to this one. Go, Evie. I also wanted to talk a little bit about some of the other things in the book. There's a long poem by somebody named Brodsky. Is that real?
It's real in that it's really a poem, but I wrote it.
Okay. Because sometimes I would just, again, go down the rabbit hole and see, had you researched this? Did it come from something else?
Yeah.
The other thing that I would love to talk about is this concept of, are Jews white? And can you talk about how that was in the book and what your feelings are?
Sure. Yeah. One of the things that Len and Miri find themselves explaining to the golem as they make their way to this white supremacist rally is what these people mean when they're saying Jews will not replace us. The golem is like, I don't understand. How do they mean? What do they mean Jews will not replace us? And this gets into a discussion because the golem is like, I'm trying to, maybe I can find the passage and even read it, because that might be easier than me trying to paraphrase it. So the golem is watching this video of the Charlottesville marchers. He watched it 3 more times, then said, "They think we are white? No, they think we are not white. They are right. We are Jewish." The golem thought for a moment. "If they know we not white, why they afraid we replace them?" "It's complicated," said Len, and then added, "these days. The Jews, Ashkenazi Jews, Eastern European Jews, everybody in this car, we're kind of white now in this country," he explained, already feeling unequal to the task. "We pass as, we're seen as white, except by racists. They think that Jews have some kind of secret, hive-minded conspiracy, and we're all working together to destroy the white race and the whole power structure that keeps white Christians on top, and that we're doing it by pretending to be white. So they're calling us out on that. But also, they think that as the secret puppet masters of the world, we want to replace them in the workforce with immigrants, or black people, or, I don't know, robots. So it's got a couple of meanings." The golem thought about that for a while. "From what the golem remember," he said slowly, "for most of history, everybody hate Jews because Jews not want, how you say, soup san zik." "Assimilate," said Miri. "Well, yeah, that too. Being white is a pretty new option for us. Nobody, almost nobody, was always white in America. Not the Irish, not the Italians, not the Poles. It's kind of like the mafia. Every once in a while, whiteness opens the books and admits new members, so white people have the numbers to keep running shit. But if you say yes, you've got to play by their rules. So like when they opened the books for us, we walked away from the civil rights movement and told ourselves we were doing it because black people had walked away from us." The discussion goes on. At some point, Len realizes these aren't his thoughts, that he's actually paraphrasing this poem he had to read as part of a teacher training, and we get the poem which goes into further detail. And what he just said is an oversimplification, the notion that when Jews became white, they walked away from the civil rights movement. That idea gets challenged and complicated as the book goes on, but fundamentally, I am, in this book and in other books, very interested in the evolving relationship between Jews and whiteness in this country. The fact that whiteness is this mutable concept, that it gets bestowed upon people, and what that bestowal gives and takes away, morally, ethically, practically speaking. I do think that one of the stories of my lifetime is the last flickering of what was a progressive civil rights alliance, for example, and the way that the specter of Black anti-Semitism was used as moral cover for the retreat of Jews from not just that alliance, but other alliances as well. We see that playing out in different ways today. So I'm very interested in exploring this, particularly as somebody who has spent a lot of time in their life in Black cultural spaces and art forms, as somebody who grew up in hip hop and jazz, as a rapper, as a DJ, as somebody who ran a hip hop magazine, as someone who spent 7 years on the road as a roadie for a jazz drummer. These are spaces and ideas that I've been thinking about for a long time. So they're going to find their way into even a work like The Golem of Brooklyn, which isn't about Blacks and Jews. It's about Jews and white people ultimately, and supernatural mud creatures.
Absolutely. Neil asks again, you're associated with some of the greatest contemporary Jewish humorists. What is it that as a people we need to deal with serious subject with humor? Why is it that Dave Barry, the whitest of white humorists, finds himself so comfortable with Jews?
Dave Barry finds himself comfortable with Jews, first of all, because Dave Barry is drunk most of the time. No, I'm just kidding. Dave Barry's wife is Jewish, so it starts there. I think Dave Barry, I mean, look, if you're funny and if you want to be surrounded by funny people, you better be comfortable with Jews. That's otherwise you're just going to be hanging out with like Bob Hope, you know? I think that Jewish humor in general, but Jewish humor in particular, has evolved to offer a lot of relief and succor, but also incisiveness. I think there's a way that Jewish humor can, in very few words, like get right to the heart of so many of the contradictions, the paradoxes, the complexities of Jewish life, all of which are on some level absurd, or would be if they weren't also so painful and so, the cause of so much violence. Like, there are a couple of Jewish jokes that to me are just, speak so many volumes. And in classic Jewish tradition, those jokes are hated by approximately half of the Jewish population. Like, my favorite Jewish joke, the one that to me is the most incisive, my mother was like, please stop telling that joke in public. So I'm going to tell that joke right now, and half of you will hate it. So the joke goes like this. There's this Jewish guy who moves in next door to Rockefeller. And his house is like just as big and just as opulent. And he hires the same gardener to trim the hedges, and he buys the same car. And one day, as he's walking out of his house to go to work, Rockefeller's walking out of his house. And Rockefeller looks over and he says, hey, you think you're as good as me, don't you? And the Jewish guy's like, as good as you? Huh, I think I'm better than you. Rockefeller is furious. He demands to know why. And the Jewish guy's like, well, for one thing, I don't live next door to a Jew. I fully expect that half of you will hate that joke. To me, it's brilliant. The way that the way that it turns anti-Semitism back on the anti-Semite, but also speaks to a certain kind of internalized self-hatred, but also the wit to use it. I mean, to me, that joke does everything. Like, if I could write that joke, I wouldn't have to write novels.
I thought it was funny. Len wants to know, are you familiar with Pete Hamill's book, Snow in August? And if so, do you have comments about his depiction of the golem?
I haven't read that. I've read Pete Hamill. I even got to meet Pete Hamill years ago in New York at a bar, obviously at a bar. But I haven't read that yet. I should. I know that it's a well-regarded golem tale.
Yeah. I want to put in the chat. This is the Amazon link to Golem in Brooklyn. If you want to go to the bookstall or any of your indie books, of course, we recommend that. Brenda wants to know, I have to get back to Brenda. Do you have any other books in progress? What other themes are you thinking about?
Going back to the similarity between the golem and superheroes, it's a truism that superheroes in the comics never really die. They only die for a little while and then they come back. The golem is the same thing. He can be made and unmade. So almost as soon as I finished this book, I started thinking about a sequel to it because I felt like I had more to say about the golem. So I'm some ways down the road in at least thinking about a sequel to this book. I'm also doing some TV and some movie stuff at the moment. I'm helping a friend of mine, the director of the movie Barry that I wrote, brought me in to help him rethink a documentary he recently shot, which is his search for the elusive uh, inventor of Bitcoin, Satoshi Nakamoto. Very different from this. But an intriguing project for me to come in and kind of like, the journalism is really good. The narrative around Vikram's search and who he is needed help. So I got to kind of come in, and it was an interesting process because the movie is shot. Every scene is more or less locked. The question is, can I make this movie better simply by rewriting the voiceover, by
Yes, you
making
can.
Vikram a different character? That's what I'm trying to do right now. So I'm doing those two things. I have a kid's book coming out in the summer. And yeah, and really I'm touring and talking about this book at least through the end of the year. So that's also keeping me pretty busy right now. And of
Right.
course, taking care of my 3 daughters.
Yeah. You brought up your kids' books. We're at the end here. So Go the F to Sleep, hilariously funny. I love it. I think it's a good present for new parents. And someone asked me, the person who, I'll let everybody know, the person who narrates it is Samuel L. Jackson. Did you get to meet him? I think he's the perfect choice.
Yeah. It's actually been great. Sam, when you write a book that short, and that book had the benefit of a very crazy publishing experience where the book sort of went viral about 6 months before it was intended to be published. It shot up and became the #1 book on Amazon when it literally didn't exist. And we were like rushing it forward, rushing it out. So we had all this momentum. We could get whatever narrator we wanted. And the book is also so short that it's like, Tuesday morning, I'm on the phone with Audible, like, who do you want to narrate? How about Sam Jackson? An hour later, they're like, yeah, Sam's going to do it. We brought a wheelbarrow full of money to his house. And then like, literally 2 hours after that, it's like, he did it. It's done. It's great. He's going to read it on Letterman tonight. So it all happened very fast. But in the aftermath of it, Sam and I have developed a friendship, and we've collaborated several times. So he did that in 2011. In 2012, Sam starred in a Obama re-election ad that I wrote called "Wake the F Up," which was pretty cool and like won a bunch of advertising awards. In the early stages of COVID-19, I wrote a poem that Sam read on the Fallon show as a fundraiser for Feeding America called "Stay the F at Home." And then last year, I wrote and directed a Biden-Harris election ad that Sam starred in called "Same Old," which actually didn't feature any profanity because it was a television ad. So Sam and I have worked on a number of things together. We're pretty aligned politically, and he's a great guy and a lot of fun to work with.
Yeah. I knew this morning was going to be delightful, and it absolutely was. And I got a little teary-eyed at the beginning, but you told me that you never know when you launch a book, and this book came out in September, what's going to happen. And of course, it was published, and I don't know, a week later, 2 weeks later, the war started in Israel. Any last thoughts about, the Golem in Israel, the Golem during these tragedy-filled times that trauma-filled times the Jews are used to living through?
Yeah. It is true, as I was saying to you earlier, you never know what the world that you publish the book into is going to look like. It's never quite the same world that you wrote the book for or as a part of. It's funny, my publisher rushed the book out. By publishing standards, rushed the book out in that it came out less than a year after I handed it in. And my joke was that like I didn't have the heart to tell them that anti-Semitism would still be around in the winter. Their big plan was also to like publish the book right at the Jewish high holidays. And I was like, that's not like the big book buying time that you seem to think it is. Certainly the book in the world takes on a different tenor given the recent tragedy and the ongoing, tragedy that is and will be this war on all sides. I guess all I would say beyond what I've already said about the way that the Golem is never conceived of as a nuclear deterrent or an ongoing standing army, and why that is from a moral standpoint, I would also just say that the reason that I write novels, and the reason that everybody I know who writes novels, is as a container to try to hold the complexity of the world, and to bring as much humanity to it as possible. So I think in these times, it is that moral complexity that is demanded of us. I think we have to be able to, with as clear and unclouded a vision as possible, be able to condemn multiple things at once, to be able to look at both the horrors of these attacks by Hamas and condemn murder and kidnapping and rape, and also not turn a blind eye to the treatment of Palestinians over the last 75 years during this occupation. This is an ongoing horror that has been foisted upon people for far too long. And we don't have to undercut the one by acknowledging the other. And we're in a moment right now where goodwill is in such short supply, and the presumption of goodwill is in such short supply, that nobody can hear anything unless it's prefaced by an acknowledgement on any side that we aren't in favor of murder. I have many Jewish friends who are like, they don't want to, it's like, unless you begin your statement by saying I don't condone the murderous actions of Hamas, there's almost an assumption that you don't feel that way. And by the same token, folks coming from other perspectives who are not part of the Jewish world, the Jewish diaspora, unless you preface your statements with a critique of Israel's slide toward autocracy or Israel's treatment of the Palestinian people, they can't hear whatever you want to say about your own grief, your own suffering, your own history, your own trauma. So it's remarkable to me that we're in a place that's that dark. It's not surprising, but it's remarkable. And I think we all have to operate with a increased measure of care and attention to the humanity of all and the suffering of all. And we have to, I think, resist the urge to pit one type of suffering against the other, and acknowledge that all of us come to this point through deep, deep trauma and need deep, deep resolution and healing.
Beautiful answer, Schubert. I hope Adam answered your question. Adam is here through the Jewish Book Council, and Jewish Book Council or not, when that next book comes out, Adam will be in touch because I have your email now. And I really can't thank you enough. I think people will find this book something to hold on to in these heavy, heavy times. I can't recommend it enough. And I did want to tell everybody that Jimmy Tabor, from the Director of North American Abraham Initiatives, is going to give us an update on the importance of protecting shared society during this time of conflict next Sunday. So he's going to have his hands full with us next week. And it's great seeing everyone. Just a reminder, the Magen David Adom ambulance is here. Come on down. You can see it. Clergy classes start up this week. And thank you, everyone. Great morning. Just a great, great morning. And wait, let me come on. Go out and get it. You got to get it. There you go. Right. It is. It just hits it hits everything. All right, everyone. Thank you. Bye-bye.